Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a few more people that are still coming online, so we'll just wait for about 20 or 30 seconds and we'll be starting soon. Okay, I think we've got most of our attendees on. So a very warm welcome to FY24 and of course our first webinar for the new financial year. The theme for today's session is exploring ways to optimize your business, and that mainly focuses on the ways in which we can enhance our approach to employee management, certainly in the context of a number of macroeconomic factors that are out there. And that really boils down to the reason we selected this topic. There's been a lot of uncertainty about what's happening more broadly in the market, but also we've seen a real shift in the number and type of call topics handled by our advisory team that seem to be as a direct correlation to some of those changes we're seeing in the market. Our advisory team handles in excess of some 50,000 individual calls each year, and we have real-time access to what businesses are grappling with at the moment. And of course, we wanted to be able to share some of those insights with you. Now, bearing in mind, FY24 does have the potential to be one of the most challenging operating environments facing Australian businesses, probably since COVID lockdown. We're looking at a perfect storm of a dubious, at best, economic outlook, reduced confidence in the market, employees who are feeling the impact of higher living costs, and this is often leading them to turn to employers to make requests for increased wages. The hangover of supply chains costs that we're still grappling with from COVID. And finally, in the midst of all this, the federal government has, of course, introduced a raft of hard-hitting legislative changes that have dramatically increased the workload on businesses if they want to remain compliant and stay on the right side of the law. So these changes, which of course stemmed from the Secure Jobs and Better Pay amendments to the Fair Work Act, have already introduced things like the abolition of pay secrecy, the introduction of the 10 days domestic violence leave allowance, positive duty on sexual harassment prevention in the workplace, and there are a raft more changes about to come down the barrel this year. So look, we will be exploring a number of rather difficult and challenging topics today. No doubt this is going to throw up a number of questions from those of you online. So if you do have a question, we will be taking some time at the end of this session to try to answer as many of them as we can. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, and we'll be able to go from there. But I would like to introduce today my fellow presenter. Wes O'Donnell and I have worked together for almost a decade and is our National Workplace Relations Manager. If we could jump to the next slide. There we go. So Wes is in fact our National Workplace Relations Manager. He heads up our advisory team that sits within HR Assured, and myself, Alistair McDonald, the Head of Business Development and Marketing for FCB Group. You'll see that our friends in marketing have been very kind to use an extremely old headshot, so we are probably due for a new photographer in the near future. But before we begin, of course, we would like to introduce the FCB group of businesses, of which HR Assured is one part. So FCB is approaching 33 years old. We started first and foremost as a specialist workplace relations law firm, and to this day, that is all we do. We have 5 accredited specialists in our partnership of 8 and some 20 solicitors who work very closely with our FCB Smart Visa team in immigration law and also assisting businesses with all their visa requirements. HR Assured, of course, is approaching its 10-year anniversary. It's one of Australia's leading outsourced HR and work health and safety solutions, which of course encompasses our in-house HRIS software, which is Enable HR. And on the bottom line, we've got our two newest additions to the FCB family, which is QMS and Best Practice, together of which make the second largest certified accrediting body in Australia. So we work with hundreds of businesses on getting their ISO certification. But if we change slides, we'll have a look at what we're looking to cover today, and I'll hand over to Wes to go through that. Thanks, Wes.
Thanks, Ali, and thank you for everyone's time and joining us today to cover across this really important topic. I sometimes think of our role as a privileged position in that we can get a real grapple upon what is challenging businesses and what they're addressing within their business at any point in time. And sometimes that's a privileged position because we're seeing a number of months ahead of where the market commentary actually is. So today's presentation is mainly to share that experience with you, to give you some insights around what businesses are thinking, what questions they're raising with us, and how we're supporting those businesses navigate the really difficult landscape in which they're currently operating. So through today's session, we're going to discuss a couple of issues around inflation versus the challenging issues of raising wage costs and the impact that's having on businesses, how you can potentially navigate requests for wage increases that your employees will inevitably ask for. We're hearing a lot around that in the media. Questions around restructuring and how you can optimize your business through this challenging time. Now, of course, as Ali mentioned, we'll leave enough time to address any questions that you may have. So please raise any questions throughout the session, and we'll address as many of those as we can at the end of today's session. The first thing we wanted to do is to provide a little bit of an overview in relation to the current economic environment. Now, there's lots of media commentary in relation to interest rates and the role of the RBA and the impact upon which the rising cost of living is having, both from an economic operation perspective, but also on individuals' household budgets. So I want to discuss a little bit around how we're tracking in the context of inflation, and then compare that against the wage reality, and to draw upon some experiences that we're seeing in other countries, which kind of gives us an overview of where we may be heading in the forward 6-month period. Now, a lot has been said in relation to inflation and how inflation is above the target range that the Reserve Bank has set. As we probably all know, the Reserve Bank has a targetary position of inflation of between 2 and 3% over the cycle. So that means that whilst inflation may come out of that band at any particular point in time, the Reserve Bank tries to maintain inflation within that parameter. Now, of course, given a number of circumstances which we won't get into, inflation has peaked in Australia around 7.8% in December of last year, and the Reserve Bank and the government is struggling with bringing that under control. We're seeing that the inflation rates in Australia have peaked and are coming more in line with the range which we would expect. And the annualized inflation rate in Australia is now reduced down to 7%, with the monthly inflation rates in May recorded at 5.6%. So we are seeing that inflation rate is certainly coming down. Now, what does that mean in terms of the broader macroeconomic circumstances? Now, inflation is a really important indication. Inflation obviously impacts upon all areas of our economy, both household budgets, but obviously business expenditure. And it's important because this is a reflection of the increased cost of living or the increased cost of business. Yeah. So interest rates may fluctuate, may go up and down, but inflation is important because it shows a permanent shift in the cost of living or the cost of doing business. Now you can see in the table that we've got on screen that the RBA has indicated that inflation will come back down significantly, it anticipates, in 2024 and return to normalized levels in 2025. With that, however, Part of the solution to driving better inflation is, monetary policy, which has an impact upon economic growth and unemployment. So many of you will know that there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment rate. So as we drive inflation down, there's an expectation that unemployment rates go up. And you can see in the table there that the RBA anticipates that unemployment rates will increase from 3.5% and be driven up above 4.5%, closer to 5% in the next year. We can also see that top line, which is probably the more challenging metric and one which businesses more closely monitor, is that economic, or that headline economic growth figure. So we can see that economic growth is slowing somewhat in the June quarter to 1.75%, and then is anticipated coming back up towards the end of 2024 and 25. Now, the concern that many businesses and people in the media have is that there is obviously a risk of recession in Australia. Now, many economic forecasters are anticipating that that risk is around 50%, that Australia may go into a recession, and that recession is considered to be 2 successive quarters of negative economic growth. We are seeing that that is a significant risk in other comparable industrialised economies. We've seen challenging circumstances in the UK where inflation is peaked at 11% and is now at around the 9%. We've seen challenging circumstances in New Zealand where inflation has peaked at 7.2% and now down, but they have recently announced that they are officially in a recession. So there's quite challenging circumstances in a number of industrialised economies which are comparable to Australia, which raises a level of concern that we are certainly in for some unstable and challenging times ahead. Now, we're not wanting to be alarmist in any way. The purpose of this presentation is not to cause concern or to be alarmist in any way, but to share some insights around how some of our businesses are considering those challenging economic circumstances, how they're preparing their business in case there are some difficult economic times ahead, and to share some of the learnings that we've found through that process. Probably one of the closest comparators that we can see is the New Zealand economy. Now, the New Zealand economy in many respects is different to the Australian, but New Zealand did go harder in terms of increases in their interest rates to address inflation at a much quicker rate than Australia has. There's a suggestion that that more aggressive interest rate movement may have pushed the economy into recession, where the economy contracted by 0.7% and then 0.1% in the last quarter. So they're officially in recession, but the signs in New Zealand are that there will be significant economic challenges in the next 6 months, which they're going to have to address. Economic forecasts and commentators are indicating that there's probably a 50% chance that Australia will go into recession. And this is, the second time that would have happened in the last 15 years. Obviously, we dipped into recession briefly during the COVID pandemic. But generally speaking, we've had a really strong period of continued and successive economic growth over the last 16-year period. So what does that mean for us? Firstly, I want to get into a bit of a process to consider, firstly, the distinction between inflation versus rising wage costs. Yeah? Given the uncertainty around the economic circumstances we're about to go into, there's a number of things which we would ordinarily recommend. Yeah? The first is that there are a number of operational changes to your business that may warrant review, but the most pressing, particularly given the timing of this presentation, is pay increases. Typically within Australia, pay increases are afforded to people in the July period, June-July period, to align with the financial end of the financial year. That's generally the common process that we would find most of our clients go through. We would typically find that most of our clients align pay increases at this time of year with appraisals and other forms of reviews which have already been undertaken, and that any increase is typically aligned both with the economic success or the achievements of a business within the previous year, as well as forecast and economic indicators for the forward period. Now, while we have high inflation, which peaked at 7.8%, and now the monthly inflation figures for May is around 5.6, that does not of itself indicate that wages are rising by the same amount. We have what we call a wage price index, which is generally an economic metrics which identifies the rising cost of wages in a period compared to the prior period. And typically speaking, that wage price index is currently pegged well below the inflation rate. So you can see there that the wage price index has peaked, coming down somewhat from 4.2% and is currently sitting in the Australian market at 3.7% for the year prior. So what this effectively means is that on average, we're seeing that private and public sector wages are increasing at around the 3.7% mark. So this should give you a rough indication that while some of your employees are expecting wage increases to match inflationary pressures, that doesn't necessarily correlate to the experience within the market. We are seeing that private sector wage rises are somewhat higher than public sector and averaging out of that 3.7%. We are seeing, however, having said that, that the proportion of wages which are having a higher increase this year compared to last is increasing. So just to put that a different way, over 60% of people in the labour market experienced a higher wage increase this year compared to last. Yeah. So the proportion or the percentage of that increase is increasing over time. And I think that's to do with the inflationary pressures. So with the wage price index, there is a number of things to consider. A large number of the workers within the Australian economy are covered by an enterprise agreement or a modern award. Yeah. Firstly, we well know that there is an increase in the national minimum rate of pay, which was a relatively large one. There's some structural reasons why it was so large, and that's because it changed the comparative rate. Not many people are paid at the national minimum rate, however, so there's probably lesser of an impact around that significant increase. For those, however, who are employed under a modern award, there was a 5.75% increase which was afforded to those individuals from the first full pay period in July. Now that is a significant pay increase, and there's a number of reasons behind it, including the economic circumstances and the need to provide a relevant safety net for those which are low paid and significantly impacted by the cost of living crisis. One of the first things we need to do when assessing our wage structure within an organisation is to assess whether our people are, firstly, covered by an enterprise agreement or modern award, and review the salary against that benchmark. Quite commonly, where we find people are engaged under an enterprise agreement or a modern award, they are already paid in excess of the minimum entitlements contained within that industrial instrument. So one of the first things we're needing to consider is if our people are covered by an enterprise agreement or a modern award and already paid above the minimum, do you need to pass on the 5.75% increase? The answer is no. And many businesses are looking at whether they will pass on an increase, which will still peg them above the industrial instrument, but not necessarily passing on the full 5.75%. Something which is really worth considering, given that historically many businesses that were paying in above the minimum entitlements may still pass on the same percentage increase. We're also seeing that businesses are being more creative in ways in which they're managing pay requests by award-covered employees and also those employees which are salaried or not covered by an enterprise agreement or modern award. So first thing to consider is that for those employees which are covered by an enterprise agreement or a modern award, there is an absolute entitlement that they receive a remuneration structure which is at least equivalent to the modern award. For those, however, who are paid in excess of that base entitlement or are award free, there is a number of creative ways in which businesses are addressing an employee's request for a higher remuneration package, given the inflationary pressure within the market, versus the need of a business to maintain pressure upon its labour cost base. And this is something that we've seen businesses call through with frequency, and they are struggling with how they can meet the expectations of their workforce whilst also maintaining, wages at a reasonable level within their business. So some of the things that we're looking at is not necessarily entering into discussions with straight line percentage increases. It is a challenging argument and discussion to be had when we're simply having discussions around the percentage of increase which will be afforded or flowing through. And that's a challenging discussion because inevitably, someone's going to be unhappy. Employee is going to be unhappy that you can't pass on the increase that you expect. Business is unhappy because effectively it's placing undue pressure upon their labour cost base. So some of the options that we're exploring with our clients is to consider both financial and non-financial targets. So think about ways in which you can pass on increases, but subject to certain milestones or conditions. They may be, as an example, increase in productivities, efficiencies, or business achievements, which means that effectively increases are not afforded unless these significant milestones are achieved. Think about non-financial benefits, which are particularly attractive to workers at this point in time. And one of the biggest discussions that many businesses are having at the moment is working from home arrangements. Are there ways in which you can provide structural benefits which are non-financial? We know that people are looking for these non-financial benefits, which post-COVID have become entrenched in the way in which people like to work. Can you offer greater certainty around working from home requirements, greater flexibility, and other type of non-financial benefits, which will really make you out as an employer of choice and create a degree of stickiness within your labour force, despite the wages and salaries that you pass on. We are also seeing a big increase towards what we call push targets, and these are incentives provided to employees in the event that they achieve a stretch or a push target. And put simply, this is where we incentivize people to achieve more than what they otherwise would in their role, which will then trigger some form of financial and non-financial benefit. Think about other options such as learning and development opportunities, paying for education or advancement, something which obviously a lot of people are looking for at this point in time. It will provide both a benefit to the individual, but also a benefit to the organisation through greater advancement and education as well. And think about more structural incentives around promotions and career succession, which binds an employee through the organisation without necessarily relying upon increases in salary or direct financial benefit. So when assessing a person's salary and navigating the discussions that inevitably many of our clients and businesses will be having at this point in time, I'd encourage you to think about other ways in which you can incentivize and reward people, which shares the burden, but also incentivize people to actually achieve more than would otherwise be expected in their role. So I'll briefly hand over to Ali to give you an overview of how you may reach out and how we can support in these circumstances.
Thanks very much, Wes. So look, this slide, we'll leave it up here for about 30 seconds. You'll notice the QR code is there on the left. So if you do have a query or a question, something that's either been generated from what we've covered already at the first half of the webinar, or something that's already grappling with in your business, please do scan the code. We will be in touch. This is an offer for our attendees today, and it's a confidential, obligation-free conversation with one of our workplace relations consultants. So normally in our webinars, we do offer a couple of health checks. We have a diagnostic tool to be able to help businesses gauge their level of compliance or how close they are to best practice for HR or work health and safety. Some of those will be available, but understanding the nature of today's content and what we've seen in regards to our recent influx of business inquiries, we understand that there might be some particular issues that you'd be seeking some guidance on from an expert. So we'll leave that up there for a moment. For those of you that aren't able to see the slides or on your mobile, we will be making the URL available after this and sending it around. Thanks, Wes. That's probably enough time, and we will display this slide again later on in the presentation, but back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ali. And I really would encourage all of you to take up that offer where relevant. I appreciate that some of this topic may be very challenging, maybe confidential in its nature, and you may not wish to ask specific questions. You know, if you have any more specific experiences and you'd like some assistance, by all means, reach out through that process. Happy to support. Now, one of the natural outcomes of addressing uncertainty within our economic environment is a discussion around redundancies and restructures. I would like to challenge the negativity around this particular topic, which is often viewed as a business failing or being unsuccessful in a certain respect. But I also think that this process of reviewing the organizational structure is a necessary one from time to time to ensure that your operating structure is optimal and aligned with your business requirements and future operational needs. And what I mean by that is quite often an organizational structure will organically change over time, but still maintain historic legacy issues from the requirements and the operational needs of 5-10 years prior. And sometimes it's timely and appropriate to really strategically assess that organizational structure and stress test whether it's right and fit for purpose at that point in time, and whether there can be a benefit in addressing that moving forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that will shed roles. I'm not suggesting that it will necessarily lead to termination of individuals, but there's a couple of things that I'll point out. The first thing when we look at organizational restructures is effectively whether your org structure is fit for purpose. Yeah? Whether it is aligned with what you're necessarily needing to achieve, whether you have the right people in the right roles to achieve the output that you need at that point in time. The first thing I'd probably suggest that you do is look at the org chart to see whether that's fit for purpose, and then to align the roles, both KPIs, expectations, and output with your current requirements. And often that process alone is a really important one and increases productivity quite substantially, because we're really aligning people's expectations on what a successful role looks like with the needs of the business at that point in time. And it can be really transformational. Yeah. And we see with some of our clients that undertake this process that we're necessarily, having people, stuck into a rut, or stuck into what they thought was what their role should be, and it's really helping that business move along. Where, however, we're seeing that there is a need for some change in the organizational structure, a redundancy or a change may be necessary or appropriate. Now, the first thing we can consider is whether there's the opportunity to achieve those outcomes through what I would call a soft change. Yeah? And that is that we have an organizational structure which is pretty good, could be better, could be streamlined, could be more effective or efficient. There is a few tweaks that need to be made, but effectively we can achieve it without a large amount of disruption. Now, those soft changes can typically be achieved through natural attrition. We can, wait for people to leave roles and redeploy people around or change their positions. It can be achieved by slowing down a recruitment strategy or a recruitment process. It can be achieved by looking at people that are relatively new to the business or still working through their probationary period, which means that we're not necessarily having to reach into established people and established roles to achieve that outcome. If, however, further deeper change is required, then we are needing to undertake a redundancy process proper, which is effectively where we determine that as a result of structural or operational or economic circumstances, particular roles are no longer required to be performed by anyone. Now, when we're undertaking redundancy, there is a couple of requirements that must be considered. Firstly, there must be a genuine redundancy, meaning that there is genuinely no longer a requirement for the role to be performed by anyone. Secondly, we need to ensure that we're complying with any enterprise agreement or modern award, which has an obligation to consult. And thirdly, we need to consider reasonable options for redeployment within the organisation, which may retain that individual rather than resulting in that employee's employment being terminated. Where we fail in any of those three requirements, the business is exposed to an unfair dismissal finding, and there is a number of other significant impacts which may arise. So it's really important that when you go through this process, that we plan for the outcome. Assess what your operational requirements are first. What is our current state of play versus where we need to be? What are those operational requirements? And typically that would involve an assessment around where we see our output, our trade, our demand being in 3, 6, 12 months' time. We're assessing our organizational structure versus where we want to be, not necessarily where we are now. Forward planning is the success through this process. Consider obligation or your ability to achieve that outcome through a soft approach, and then consider your broader obligations to consult with your workforce to achieve those objectives if we can't achieve those objectives through a softer approach. Naturally, we need to consider redeployment opportunities and also the economic cost of going through that process, given that naturally there is an expense through wages, notice, pay in lieu of notice, but also redundancy pay as a result of any roles which are displaced. Now, whilst redundancies is a necessary topic to discuss in this topic, given that we're talking about how we can best place our business in light of the uncertain economic circumstances we're facing, I think there's some other trends that we can also share, which is really important and we'll probably avoid getting there in the first place. Now, I've pulled together historical data on the number of calls that we've taken in the 12 months prior versus what we've taken in the 3 months, and I can explain that. Probably as a result of COVID, we've seen the number of advisory activities or the mix of those advisory activities change quite substantially in the last 3 years. And naturally, there was lots of questions around COVID and immunization and the effects of the COVID pandemic on us. And that's now settled and moved into other conversations around establishing engagement and establishing roles through contracts, award compliance, employer terminations, etc. Having said that, though, the number of inquiries that we're receiving in the last 3 months is significantly skewed towards operational requirements, productivities, and wage growth within an organization. So we are seeing that there is a certain trend away from more established issues around contracts, recruitment, award compliance, etc., through to more difficult conversations around productivity, wage growth, reviews, restructures, etc. And that's possibly an indication of the economic certainty in which we're operating in, or businesses starting to plan for that unknown future environment. So some of the tips that we can provide or some of the experiences that we're going through are things such as how businesses can increase productivity and efficiencies without having to increase their labour cost base. Already given you some tips previously on how many businesses are approaching that through their REM review process, by way of push targets and other forms of incentives, which seeks to drive improvements in productivity and efficiencies and limits the direct economic increase or economic cost until those improvements or increases are achieved. We're also seeing that many businesses are looking at optimizing their labour cost base by looking at the engagement structure which they have. Now, that may be things such as assessing the proportion of casuals which are employed versus permanent employees. May also be things such as assessing the ongoing usage of independent contractors or labour hire arrangements. And we're seeing that many businesses are now reviewing those structures to see whether there's any optimization which can be achieved. We are seeing in some circumstances that businesses are placing a recruitment freeze or undertaking a much closer assessment around the viability of a role, particularly where that role is a new role, and needing there to be a more forensic benefit assessment being undertaken before that's placed. We're also seeing that that is linked with recruitment and engagement strategies, and a process where businesses are reviewing position descriptions and aligning them more closely with their current operational requirements in order to optimize performance and productivity. That's one in particular that I would really encourage businesses to undertake. And we're seeing with many of our businesses, our clients that we support, that there has been really significant improvements which have been achieved through that process. And it's also resulted in increases in employee engagement through that process as well. Businesses are also addressing, people with excessive annual leave entitlements, seeking to reduce those costs through directions to draw down that leave at reasonable periods which don't impact upon the organisation. They're also looking at roster optimization as well, which is a significant and important process for any business which is engaging people by the hour. Critically assess whether there's the ability to reduce the value of your labour cost base by reducing the incidences of overtime, reducing the amount of work performed outside the span of ordinary hours, as an example, or other ways which can effectively reduce the total labour cost base. So there's some great tips there, I think, that people can look at and to start considering in new business without having to proceed through to the formal redundancy or restructure process. And many of these will get you the easy wins that you need whilst you consider the uncertainty that we're experiencing. I would strongly encourage you, though, as I've said before, to call through and speak to one of our consultants if you have any need or hesitation. One of the benefits, as I said at the start, of our service is that we're supporting businesses implement strategies well before the economic circumstances land. So many times you'll be speaking to consultants which have their finger on the pulse in the industry which you operate and have supported many businesses like yours navigate the same type of issues. So we'd welcome a discussion with any of you, and I'll hand over to Ali to give you an overview of how you can reach out.
Thanks, Wes. Appreciate that. So look, we've got this same slide back up again. I'll leave this up. So for those of you that do want to take us up on the offer, please take a photo of the QR code and we'll be in touch to set up a time for a confidential and completely obligation-free discussion with one of our experts. I have seen that we've had an explosion in questions that have come through the Q&A segment. So I will be looking to feed some of those into Wes at the moment. There are a number pertaining to the future economic outlook. I'll leave those to one side. Please have a conversation with your financial advisor or local economist to deal with those, but we will of course tackle all the ones that we have time for regarding people management, HR, and so forth. So Wes, a couple of these that have come through. What are you finding the biggest challenges facing businesses right now when navigating people management?
Yeah, good question. Well, it's going to vary from business to business, but also industry to industry. So it's difficult to provide one generic answer across everything. I think some of the biggest issues that have caused some complexity for clients is navigating the approach through the REM review process, which is pretty current at the moment. We are seeing employees experiencing difficulty through inflationary pressures and the cost of living crisis, but also how a business can respond to that need and balance that against the need to maintain wage growth at a reasonable level. Yeah. So I think that's been challenging and challenging for some businesses in particular. And I think it's challenging when you approach it from the lens of just a straight financial consideration, because naturally there's a disparity in interest. Employees want to achieve a high wage growth to the extent that's possible. It's in the interest of an employer to maintain that in a controllable way. I think, though, that where businesses struggle is where they approach it from that straight auction type approach, whereas they really would benefit from addressing it from a wider structural productivity, efficiency, non-financial benefit approach. So we can often achieve the expectations that the employee wants, but in a way which delivers us greater benefit as well. So as I've said before, we can say to an employee that increases will be more pegged towards the labour wage index. However, in the event that you achieve stretch targets or other forms of incentives, well, then an additional benefit may flow, which, subject to you achieving those outputs, will still get you the result that you're seeking. So I think that's sometimes a different discussion. And I think it's a discussion that businesses haven't necessarily had to do with frequency in the past, given that we've had successive periods of growth. But now we're needing to really consider how we can have those meaningful discussions in a new and innovative way. And there are a lot of the discussions that we're having at the moment, Ali.
Thanks, Wes. The next question we've got in line, what you've presented on is great advice. If our business wanted to undertake a job description review and KPIs, do you have any tips for ensuring our employee engagement is not impacted?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I do. Some businesses, I must say, are really reluctant to undertake the process, given the level of disruption it may cause or the potential for dispute within the workplace. I have found, and this is just my personal view, in some of the clients that we've been doing this with, that where you undertake a process keenly focused on improving engagement as well as productivity, efficiencies, and aligning roles against operational requirements, it actually does result in a real increase in engagement. You find that people appreciate the extent to which companies consult. You'll find that motivated and engaged employees are excited by the prospect of refreshing their role and making sure that they're adding value to an organization. You'll find that that will result in an increased level of enthusiasm or excitement around the role. And, aligning those roles with what is of value to you now versus what was of value to you 10 years ago will naturally produce a level of productivity improvement. Now, I'm not as naive as to suggest that you're not going to receive any form of pushback or objections within your workforce. That's a natural result on occasions where things are changing. But often through this process, you'll tend to find that people will identify where they're unhappy, and they're the detractors through your strategy. So it's often a useful process anyway to identify areas within your workforce which are detracting from your strategy, and then you can deal with them through exception. But you get the consultation process right, you engage with people, and I've found that it's a really useful exercise to actually increase people's engagement, excitement, and productivity as a result. So it isn't easy, and it does require foresight, does require planning. But I'm seeing that where businesses devote that time, energy, and resource, there are a lot of benefits to flow from that.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I both have more than 30 employees each in our divisions. I think the importance of a structured, performance review session, it's almost a natural extension and the right opportunity to be able to look at what the appropriate KPIs and changing those with, some degree of regularity becomes a natural extension of that. And of course, the other thing is, you incentivize people the way you want them to behave. We've spoken before about stretch targets or putting in place some upside to people going the extra mile to increase productivity. So probably just add that from my seat.
The reason I explain it just really quickly is if I think about what I did in my role 5 years ago versus what I did 10 years ago, fundamentally different to what I'm doing now. But what the business valued as an output 5 years ago versus 10 years ago is also fundamentally different to what I'm delivering now. So I kind of promote within any organization that the process of reviewing and updating your position descriptions should be a natural process, every 5 years anyway, because what you're really doing is you're saying that the business needs have changed. What we value now has changed, and that's just a natural process. And what we're needing to do is to align your position description, which is more reflective of those needs. Get that right. People are motivated, they're targeted, they're more specific in aligning their actions and their duties with what the business is going to value. And it's just a really great way of motivating, but also, focusing people's attention to what the business needs at any particular point.
Yeah, agree, mate. Thank you. Look, we've got time for a couple more. The next one, my question's about wage growth and the recruitment market. Are you finding the recruitment market is changing? And are we seeing more realistic salary expectations from candidates?
Yeah, really good question. As an employer, I think so. We found through COVID and probably the last, 18 months to 2 years that the recruitment market in certain areas was particularly challenging. Now, I have to say that this varies from industry to industry, but also geographical location. I do know some states and particular locations are really still struggling with the ability to find recruits or candidates, and particularly struggling with the salary expectations of those people that are on the market. But from what clients tell me, generally, we are seeing that the tide has changed and it's turned quite significantly. We're hearing from clients that, generally speaking, again, it changes from location to location and industry, but generally the labour market or the recruitment market isn't as tough as what it used to be, and that the salary expectations of individuals are now becoming more realistic and more aligned with that availability in the labour market. We are also hearing that businesses are really exploring non-financial benefits and really having to promote themselves as the employer of choice. Now, whilst that's always been the case, we are still hearing that is, something which is growing. And we're also seeing a level of expectation that candidates are expecting that to be reflected within their contract rather than discretionary policies. And we're probably seeing some dispute with CommBank at the moment. And a forecast that I can probably suggest is that we'll start to see those non-financial benefits and workplace arrangements being formalized in contracts and enterprise agreements to a much greater extent moving forward.
Thanks, mate. I've only recently found out about the positive duty obligations and the respect at work laws. Does HR Assured have solutions to mitigate these risks?
Yes.
Well, I could probably take that firstly before I throw to you as the shameless plug for HR Assured. No, we have, of course, had an influx of inquiries, both as far as new business is coming to us. This has been a key driver in regards to businesses not sure how they can best navigate this. The positive duty around preventing sexual harassment, falling under the Respect at Work laws, but also part of the broader secure jobs and better pay legislative changes, do require a far greater emphasis on the employer to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, to be able to raise it. I'll throw to Wes to talk about the specifics, but HR Assured have in fact made a number of changes to our offering, providing businesses with a turnkey solution to manage this, particularly in regards to updated sexual harassment policies, but also an e-learning solution that has just been launched. It's 7 core modules. It allows businesses to deploy this very quickly in a bulk launch to all employees, and really ensure that the employees are aware of what sexual harassment constitutes, how it's prevented, but also helping the business meet their obligations as easy and quickly as possible, particularly with more people working from home, geographically dispersed workforces, being able to handle that online. We've seen to be of great benefit. But Wes, I guess I'll throw to you for any more you could add to that.
No, I think that you've addressed it, Ali. I think that, yes, there's been some significant changes in the area of sexual harassment, and more specifically, the creation of a positive duty upon employers to address sexual harassment in the workplace. It's a really important change in the context of how that legislation is worded. So, historically it used to be, thou shalt not sexually harass someone in the workplace, but that's really shifted. And whilst that's still there, there's now a positive duty, meaning that employers must take positive steps to avoid sexual harassment in the workplace, and must do a number of other things. And that positive duty obviously means that you need to get it right. Otherwise, there's some significant penalty structures which may apply, but also it means that you are unable to defend any sexual harassment claim in the event that you've not complied with your positive duty obligation. So we've done some great things. Ali's mentioned them around, supporting businesses through education and developing e-learning modules which can be deployed into your wider business, which is relevant for all employees. I think that's great. I think the frequency which we're going to push updates through that channel is really important as well. And it's a really cost-effective, low-touch approach through micro-learning, where we can support individuals' understanding of reasonable professional behaviour in the workplace without bringing them offline for extended periods whilst they undertake that training. The other thing I'd suggest is that, with the greatest respect, if you're not across the sexual harassment requirements already, it probably suggests that you're not across a number of other really important legislative changes which have already come in place. And I'd also suggest that you're needing to really pay close attention to some of the changes which we're forecasting to come down the pipe in the next 6 months. Some of the more challenging and controversial changes to our industrial legislation is forecast in the next 6 months, including much more significant penalties around underpayment of wages, criminalisation of wage theft, restrictions on the wage payments to on-hire workers, etc. So I'd really encourage you to stay close to HR Assured. We will drive communication and support our clients on all of those changes. And I really do think that this year and early stages of next, it's a really busy year for businesses in the context of the significance and volume of legislative changes which are coming down the pipe. And you throw that into the mix of a challenging, uncertain economic circumstances, there's a lot going on. And if you come off any of those requirements or you miss some of them, it means that you're really behind the 8 ball in your people management strategies, and that creates some indigestion in your business model. So happy to support. We'll of course lead the field in driving education and solutions to our clients as best we can.
Thanks, Wes. Look, we might leave it there. I'm conscious of everyone's time. Thank you very much for your time, Wes. As Wes mentioned, if you've got something immediate you'd like to speak to someone, the details are up there on the screen. If you'd like to talk to someone about more ongoing support or what we're able to do, please reach out to myself. And someone in my team can certainly talk about the support options we have available for businesses looking to deal with this. But other than that, we'll leave you there and look very much forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks very much.
Guys, have a great afternoon. Thank you for attending.